The bells rang each morning with a voice so clean it seemed incapable of lying. Their sound drifted over the village like absolution itself, calling the faithful to stone walls that promised order, mercy, and restraint. At the heart of it all stood Sister Agnes, her spine straight as doctrine, her eyes alight with conviction as she preached chastity as the highest form of devotion. To hear her speak was to feel the weight of desire fall away, replaced by the cold comfort of obedience. By day, the convent breathed incense and prayer. White habits moved like ghosts through candlelit halls, hands folded, lips murmuring vows learned by heart. Sister Agnes was everywhere, guiding, correcting, blessing. Villagers knelt before her, confessing sins they barely understood, trusting her silence more than their own blood. They never noticed how her gaze lingered, not on their faces, but on their lineage, their strength, their youth. At night, the convent changed its posture. The bells fell silent, and the stones seemed to sink inward, as though listening. Beneath the chapel, below even the burial crypts, the cellar woke. Iron doors sweated with damp. Lamps burned low, revealing faces that had learned not to hope aloud. Here prayers were not spoken, they were enforced. Lives were counted, catalogued, and controlled with the same precision Sister Agnes used to count rosary beads. She descended the steps alone, keys heavy at her waist, her shadow stretching unnaturally long against the walls. In this place, she did not preach restraint, she preached purpose. Suffering was framed as stewardship, captivity as calling. She believed, no, she knew, that she was cultivating something holy from corruption, something enduring from flesh. Above her, the convent slept peacefully, wrapped in the illusion of sanctity. Below, the truth grew quietly in the dark, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough to contain it. The first turning point establishes the nun's public identity as a figure of unquestioned moral authority, which is essential for everything that follows. She does not begin as a monster in the eyes of the world, but as a symbol. Her sermons on chastity are not casual reminders of religious discipline. They are theatrical, emotionally charged performances that leave listeners feeling both cleansed and small. She speaks of the body as a dangerous vessel, of desire as wrought, and of obedience as the only true freedom. People do not merely agree with her. They admire her, repeat her words, and measure themselves against her severity. Her reputation spreads beyond the village because she appears incorruptible. While other clergy accept gifts or soften their teachings to please donors, she refuses comfort, eats little, sleeps less, and presents her own suffering as proof of holiness. This visible self-denial convinces others that she has conquered temptation entirely. Parents trust her with their children. Benefactors fund the convent generously, believing their money supports purity itself. Church officials point to her as an example of faith done right, sharp and uncompromising. What makes this turning point disturbing is the contrast it creates. Her message of chastity is absolute, leaving no room for human weakness. Yet it attracts precisely because it promises control in a world of uncertainty. People burdened by guilt feel relief in her rigid rules. By placing herself as the moral standard, she gains power over the consciences of others. Confession becomes less about forgiveness and more about surveillance. She listens closely, not to absolve, but to assess character, bloodlines, resilience, and obedience. This public reverence also functions as armor. Any future suspicion will struggle to survive against the image she has built. When someone disappears or a question arises, the immediate response is disbelief. Someone so devoted could never be capable of wrongdoing. Her sermons reinforce this protection by framing doubt itself as sin. To question authority becomes equivalent to questioning faith, and that psychological barrier ensures silence long before fear is required. Narratively, this point is crucial because it shows that evil does not emerge in opposition to virtue, but often disguised as its most extreme form. Her obsession with purity is not incidental. It is the ideological foundation that allows her to justify control over bodies and lives later. By convincing the world that desire must be erased, she positions herself as the only one capable of deciding how flesh should be used, disciplined, or repurposed, laying the groundwork for horrors that will seem, to her, not sinful but necessary and divinely ordered. The second turning point shifts the story from unsettling admiration into quiet dread by introducing absence rather than overt violence. People do not vanish in dramatic ways. They simply stop being present. A child who once swept the chapel steps no longer appears. A debtor promised shelter at the convent is never seen again. An orphan sent for moral instruction does not return. Each disappearance is small enough to be explained away on its own, but together they form a pattern that the community instinctively avoids naming. What gives this moment its power is how quickly explanation replaces concern. The village is conditioned to accept religious authority as both benevolent and unquestionable. So every missing person is given a story that sounds reasonable enough to silence curiosity. Some are said to have been transferred to distant convents. Others are rumored to have run away, unable to bear the discipline. In a place already steeped in shame and poverty, vanishing is treated almost as a moral failure rather than a warning sign. People convince themselves that those who disappear must have deserved their fate in some way. Church authorities play a crucial role in reinforcing this dismissal. Paperwork appears where memory falters. Baptismal records are amended, deaths quietly registered without bodies, transfers documented but never verified. The language is formal, authoritative, and deliberately vague. When questions arise, they are met with rebuke rather than answers. Faith, the officials insist, is not a matter of investigation but trust. To push further would be to flirt with heresy, and that fear is enough to keep mouths closed. Sister Agnes's influence deepens during this period. She does not react defensively to rumors. She responds with sermons. From the pulpit, she speaks of divine pruning, of branches removed so the vine may flourish. She warns against attachment to the transient and urges acceptance of God's will when loved ones are taken away. Her words do not directly address the missing, but everyone understands the implication. Loss becomes a spiritual test, and grief is reframed as weakness. This turning point exposes how systems of belief can become mechanisms of erasure. The disappearances are not ignored because people do not notice them. They are ignored because acknowledging them would destabilize the moral structure that gives the community meaning. Admitting something is wrong would mean admitting that holiness itself can lie. For many, that realization is more terrifying than the idea of people quietly vanishing. Narratively, this phase builds tension through denial. Nothing is proven, nothing is confronted, and that ambiguity allows the horror to seep slowly into the background. The audience sees what the characters refuse to see. Each dismissed disappearance becomes heavier than the last, accumulating emotional weight. The convent, once a place of refuge, begins to feel like a mouth that closes behind those who enter. The psychological cruelty of this moment lies in how responsibility dissolves. No single person chooses to ignore the truth. Everyone participates just enough to keep life moving forward. Parents blame themselves for asking the convent for help. Officials blame procedure. Neighbors blame fate. Even the missing are blamed, recast as unstable or sinful to justify their absence. In this way, the evil does not need to hide aggressively. It is protected by collective relief at not having to look too closely. This turning point also prepares the ground for future revelations by showing how thoroughly truth can be buried under ritual and record keeping. When the truth eventually surfaces, it will not only expose a single villain, but an entire structure that preferred comfort over conscience. The disappearances are the story's first real wound, and because it is left untreated, it festers beneath the surface, spreading quietly through faith, fear, and the third turning point introduces discovery, but not revelation, and that distinction is what makes it so unsettling. A young novice, still new enough to notice what others have learned to ignore, encounters the locked cellar door by accident rather than intent. She is sent on a routine errand, something mundane and forgettable, and in the process wanders into a corridor that feels wrong not because it is hidden, but because it feels deliberately unfinished. The walls are older here, the stone rougher, as though the convent itself chose not to remember this place. The door stands at the end of the passage, iron, bound and unadorned, lacking the symbols of blessing that mark every other threshold in the convent. There is no crucifix, no scripture, no protective inscription. Its absence of holiness is more striking than any warning could be. The novice feels an immediate, instinctive reluctance to approach, a sensation she later struggles to describe, like standing too close to a grave before it has been filled. What unsettles her further is that the door does not exist on any map. Later, when she searches the convent's archives under the pretense of learning its history, she finds architectural drawings that show storage rooms, crypts, and wine cellars, but never this corridor, never this door. It is as though the space has been excised not physically, but intellectually, removed from collective awareness. The realization introduces a new kind of fear, not of what might be behind the door, but of how carefully it has been forgotten. At night, the door becomes impossible to ignore. Sounds carry strangely in stone buildings, and the novice begins to notice rhythms where there should be none. Footsteps long after curfew. The faint scrape of metal, low murmurs that are not quite voices and not quite prayer. These sounds are subtle enough to be dismissed, yet persistent enough to return every night once noticed. She tells herself it is imagination, a test of discipline, the mind rebelling against silence. Her training has taught her that curiosity is a form of temptation. The rules are clear: do not go where you are not sent. Do not ask questions that are not offered answers. Yet the locked door becomes a focal point for everything she has not been taught how to process. It represents contradiction in a place built on certainty. The convent preaches transparency before God, confession, exposure of the soul, and yet here is something sealed, barred, and deliberately excluded from ritual life. When she finally touches the door, it is cold in a way that feels intentional, as though it has never absorbed warmth. The lock is old but well maintained, oiled regularly, cared for. This detail troubles her more than rust or decay would have. Something unused would have been neglected. This is preserved. Someone comes here often enough to ensure it remains functional. The thought tightens into fear. The novice begins to watch. She learns the patterns of movement in the convent, the way Sister Agnes's steps sound compared to others, the way certain keys jingle differently depending on who carries them. She notices that on some nights, one set of footsteps descends and does not return for a long time. On those nights, the sounds from behind the door change, growing more restless, more alive. The novice does not understand what she is hearing, but she understands that it is not prayer. This turning point is crucial because it transforms the story from rumor into proximity. The horror is no longer abstract or secondhand. It is a physical space that can be touched, heard, and mapped in the mind. The locked door becomes a symbol of the boundary between belief and truth. On one side lies doctrine, order, and public sanctity. On the other lies something unnamed that requires secrecy to exist. The novice's discovery does not immediately lead to action because she lacks language for what she senses. Everything she has been taught encourages reinterpretation rather than confrontation. Fear is reframed as weakness. Doubt is framed as pride. The convent's teachings have not prepared her to recognize hidden evil, only external temptation. As a result, the door remains closed, not because it cannot be opened, but because opening it would require admitting that the structure she has entrusted with her soul may be built on deliberate deception. The fourth turning point deepens the unease by giving the hidden space a voice, transforming suspicion into something that can be heard, measured, and feared. Night in the convent is meant to be absolute, broken only by controlled sounds: the wind against stone, the soft shift of fabric, the regulated toll of distant bells marking prayer hours. Silence is discipline here, and discipline is safety. When that silence begins to fracture, it feels like a violation of sacred law rather than mere disturbance. It starts subtly, the way all denials prefer. A faint clink that could be metal cooling. A thud that might be a door settling in its frame. The novice hears these sounds first, because she is still listening rather than assuming. Others have learned to interpret unfamiliar noises as personal weakness or imagination, and so they never fully register them. But once the novice notices, the sounds return with rhythm. They recur at similar hours, always after the final prayers, when the convent is meant to be sealed against the world. Chains are not supposed to exist here. The convent prides itself on austerity, not restraint through force. Yet the sound is unmistakable once recognized: metal drawing against metal, slow and deliberate, followed by a sharp correction, as if something has been pulled back into place. The noise does not travel far, but stone carries vibration, and in the dead of night, even restraint echoes. The novice lies awake counting the seconds between each sound, trying to fit them into acceptable explanations that fail as soon as they are formed. Then come the voices. They are not loud enough to be words, but they carry human cadence, rising and falling with emotion. Sometimes they sound like pleading, sometimes like exhausted compliance. The most disturbing moments are when they synchronize briefly with prayer. Voices below murmuring in a warped imitation of the chants above. It is impossible to tell whether the prayers are being led or enforced, whether they are an attempt at comfort or control. The effect is deeply unsettling, as though faith itself is being ventriloquized from beneath the floor. The novice notices that Sister Agnes's sermons begin to mirror the nocturnal sounds. By day, she speaks more frequently about obedience through suffering, about sanctification achieved only when resistance is broken. These themes feel sharper now, edged with something colder. At night, the muffled prayers seem to respond to her teachings, repeating fragments in distorted rhythms. It becomes impossible to tell which came first, the doctrine or the echo, and that confusion feeds dread. Other sisters hear something too, though few will admit it openly. When the novice cautiously tests the waters, she is met with discomfort rather than disbelief. One nun crosses herself too quickly. Another advises more fasting, less thought. A third warns that the devil is attracted to curiosity. Their reactions reveal that the sounds are not entirely unknown, only unspoken. Silence, it becomes clear, is not ignorance but agreement. The convent's architecture amplifies the fear. Stone corridors stretch and narrow unpredictably, making it difficult to pinpoint where sounds originate. Noise travels upward and sideways, blurring location. This uncertainty allows the cellar to feel omnipresent, as though it is not confined to one hidden room, but threaded through the building itself. The novice begins to feel watched from below, judged by something that hears her even when she cannot see it. Ritual takes on a new tone during this phase. Candles flicker more violently. Incense feels heavier, cloying rather than cleansing. Night prayers are recited faster, as if speed might protect against listening too closely. The novice notices how Sister Agnes lingers after compline, her shadow stretching across walls as she waits for the convent to sleep. Shortly after, the familiar sounds begin again, confirming a connection that no one will articulate. This turning point strips away plausible deniability. Sounds cannot be erased like records or dismissed like rumors. They invade sleep, erode certainty, and demand interpretation. Yet the horror lies in how interpretation is redirected. Instead of leading to investigation, the noises are absorbed into the convent's theology. Suffering is reframed as necessary. Crying becomes purification. Chains, though unnamed, become instruments of order. For the novice, the nights become unbearable because they force her to choose between what she hears and what she has been taught to believe. Each sound tests the boundary between faith and complicity. Listening itself begins to feel like betrayal, yet ignoring the noises feels worse, like an active participation in something unnamed and growing beneath her feet. Something alive in the dark that responds to silence as permission. Fifth turning point shifts the horror from sensory unease into documented intent, replacing what can be heard and suspected with what has been written, signed, and quietly corrected. The novice does not set out to uncover proof. She is assigned to clerical duties meant to teach humility and patience. Copying records is considered safe work, distant from temptation, an exercise in obedience rather than thought. It is precisely this assumption that allows the truth to sit unguarded in plain sight. At first, the inconsistencies seem trivial. Dates do not align cleanly. Names appear twice under slightly different spellings. Ages shift subtly from one ledger to another, as though time itself has been adjusted to suit convenience. The novice notices these things because she is new and therefore careful. Older sisters copy without reading, trusting that accuracy has already been handled by someone else. Precision, like responsibility, has been delegated upward and forgotten. The deeper she goes, the clearer the pattern becomes. Certain names appear in baptismal records, then again months later in burial registries, despite no funerals being held and no graves marked. Other names vanish entirely after being recorded as transferred to institutions that cannot be traced. The language used is reverent, impersonal, and absolute. Souls are accounted for even when bodies are not. The implication is chilling. Existence is being managed on paper regardless of reality. What disturbs the novice most is the handwriting. It is unmistakable. The same controlled strokes appear again and again, steady and confident, never rushed, never uncertain. Sister Agnes's hand. The realization reframes everything. These are not errors nor oversights, nor the result of bureaucracy gone stale. They are deliberate acts of authorship. Someone has rewritten lives with the same care used to transcribe scripture. The novice begins to understand the power of records in a religious institution. To be written is to exist. To be crossed out is to be unmade. Death certificates do not merely acknowledge death, they legitimize it. Transfer orders do not describe movement, they justify disappearance. Once a name has been correctly placed in the right book, no further questions are permitted. The system is designed not to discover truth, but to stabilize belief. The falsification is subtle enough to appear holy. Language of sacrifice replaces language of loss. Phrases like, "returned to God's service elsewhere," and "released from earthly burden," appear frequently, vague enough to satisfy doctrine while concealing fact. The novice realizes that these words function like ritual objects, shielding readers from the need to imagine what actually happened. Faith fills in the gaps where curiosity might otherwise take root. As she cross-references older ledgers, the scope widens. The practice is not recent. It stretches back years, possibly decades, forming a parallel history beneath the official one. Entire lives have been quietly reassigned. Some names reappear generations later in new contexts, altered but familiar, suggesting lineage manipulated rather than erased. The implication is that the cellar is not merely a place of confinement, but of continuity, sustained through paperwork as much as walls. This turning point reveals a different kind of cruelty. Physical suffering is hidden below, but administrative violence happens above, normalized and invisible. By controlling records, Sister Agnes controls memory. Families searching for lost children are met with documents rather than answers. Authorities requesting audits receive clean books, impeccable in form, unassailable in tone. Truth is not denied, it is overwritten. The novice feels complicit simply by reading. Each page turned feels like participation in a lie that has already consumed countless lives. She understands now why rumors failed and sounds were ignored. The system is airtight because it anticipates doubt and neutralizes it in advance. Proof has been weaponized against truth. Anyone questioning reality can be shown ink and told to submit. What makes this moment especially devastating is the absence of chaos. Everything is orderly. The ledgers are balanced. The shelves are dusted. Evil has not disrupted the institution, it has optimized it. The convent functions smoothly because suffering has been categorized, indexed, and filed away. There is no need for secrecy when authority itself enforces forgetting. By the time the novice closes the final book, she understands that discovery alone changes nothing. The records do not expose the crime, they complete it. What happens below is sustained not just by locks and chains, but by ink, language, and the quiet agreement that what is written must be true, even when every sound in the night insists otherwise. The SIP's turning point strips away any remaining ambiguity by revealing the ideological engine behind everything that has happened. What initially appeared as hypocrisy or secret corruption is exposed as a fully formed belief system, coherent in its own logic and terrifying in its certainty. Sister Agnes is not acting against her faith, she is acting because of it, having reshaped doctrine into something that serves her private vision while wearing the language of holiness like a seal of approval. The novice learns this not through confession or confrontation, but through fragments in marginal notes, in old theological texts, sermons copied and revised repeatedly, and private writings never meant for public ears. In these pages, chastity is not defined as the absence of bodily use, but as control over it. Desire, Sister Agnes argues, is sinful only when uncontrolled. When governed by divine authority, the body becomes a resource rather than a temptation. This reinterpretation allows her to reconcile her public preaching with her hidden actions without experiencing contradiction. Central to this doctrine is the belief that certain lives exist to be directed rather than lived. She divides humanity into vessels of will and vessels of function. Those deemed spiritually weak, socially disposable, or morally compromised are reclassified as material for redemption rather than recipients of it. Their suffering is framed as participation in a sacred process they are too limited to understand. Choice, in her system, is a privilege reserved for the pure. This belief system does not emerge suddenly, it is built from familiar religious language twisted slightly off-center. She borrows metaphors of cultivation, seed, and harvest, concepts already present in Scripture, and literalizes them in ways doctrine was never meant to support. Spiritual lineage becomes more important than individual life, Continuity of a purified order outweighs personal autonomy. In her mind, she is not exploiting bodies, but stewarding them for a higher outcome. The novice realizes with horror that this theology explains everything. The disappearances, the records, the cellar, even the sermons. Chastity, as preached publicly, serves to elevate Sister Agnes above suspicion, while reinforcing a hierarchy in which she alone is fit to decide how flesh is used. By denying desire in others, she concentrates authority in herself. By presenting herself as untouched, she claims moral ownership over those she defines as fallen or unfinished. What makes this turning point especially disturbing is how internally consistent the doctrine is. It does not rely on chaos or impulse. It is methodical, disciplined, and patient. Sister Agnes believes herself chosen not because she is cruel, but because she is willing to do what others lack the strength to do. In her writings, she frames hesitation as weakness and mercy as indulgence. Compassion, she argues, must be subordinate to outcome. The novice also discovers that this belief has been taught selectively. Certain sisters are groomed to accept fragments of it, never the whole, trained to see obedience as virtue without understanding its final purpose. This creates layers of complicity without shared knowledge. Each participant believes they are serving holiness while being shielded from the full truth. Ignorance becomes a tool, not an accident. This revelation shifts the story's moral center. Sister Agnes is no longer a secret sinner hiding behind piety, but an architect of a parallel theology that repurposes faith into justification. The horror lies not only in what she does, but in how convincingly she believes it is right. There is no sense of guilt in her reasoning, only frustration that others lack her clarity. For the novice, this is the moment when fear becomes existential. If evil can be this organized, this devout, then faith itself is no longer a reliable compass. The structures she trusted are revealed as adaptable, capable of being bent to serve almost any end if language is handled carefully enough. The threat is no longer confined to a cellar or a single woman. It extends into the very framework that taught her how to think. This turning point also removes the comfort of exposure as solution. Revealing actions will not be enough, because actions are already justified within a belief system that others may find persuasive or convenient. The danger now lies in ideas, not just acts. To stop Sister Agnes would require dismantling a theology that sanctifies control and calls it order, a theology that replaces consent with calling and labels obedience as salvation. The seventh turning point marks the moment when the hidden system defends itself openly, though still disguised as holiness, transforming private horror into public ritual. An attempted escape from the cellar does not erupt into chaos, as one might expect. Instead, it is absorbed seamlessly into the convent's existing structure of discipline. This is what makes it so chilling. The system does not break under pressure. It adapts, reframes, and continues. The escape is imperfect from the start. One of the captives, driven by desperation rather than strategy, manages to reach an upper corridor before being discovered. The timing is unfortunate. Dawn prayers are approaching, and movement in the convent is already beginning. The presence of someone who should not exist creates a rupture in routine that cannot be ignored, but it is immediately controlled. Bells are rung early, sisters are summoned. Authority arrives not in panic, but in formation. What follows is not presented as punishment, but as correction. Sister Agnes addresses the gathered convent with measured calm, explaining that a soul has strayed under the influence of rebellion and temptation. She does not describe an escape, she describes a fall. The language is precise and disarming. By framing the event spiritually rather than physically, she shifts attention away from the act itself and onto its supposed moral meaning. The captive is never allowed to speak. Silence is enforced not through violence, but through ritual. The figure is positioned in the chapel, not bound, but surrounded. The posture is one of submission, indistinguishable from penance. To the untrained eye, it could pass as a sinner seeking forgiveness. To those who know the truth, it is a warning made visible. Public punishment in this context does not involve overt brutality. That would risk scandal. Instead, it uses humiliation sanctified by doctrine. The captive is required to confess generalized sins that do not correspond to reality but serve the narrative. Pride, disobedience, ingratitude for spiritual guidance. Each accusation reinforces the idea that suffering is self-inflicted, deserved, and correctable only through submission. The sisters are instructed to witness, not to question. Participation is mandatory but indirect. They are told that observing is an act of care, that communal discipline strengthens faith. By compelling them to watch, Sister Agnes binds them into complicity. To look away would be to reject correction. To intervene would be to defy authority. Silence becomes the safest response, and safety becomes indistinguishable from guilt. For the novice, this moment is devastating. Everything she has uncovered, the sounds, the records, the doctrine, condenses into a single, undeniable image. The system she feared is no longer hidden below ground or buried in books. It stands in the open, sanctified by ceremony, protected by collective obedience. The punishment is not meant to deter escape alone. It is meant to demonstrate that resistance will always be reinterpreted as sin. What makes this turning point especially powerful is how effectively it neutralizes sympathy. The captive's suffering is framed as corrective love. Any emotional response from observers is redirected inward, turned into self-examination. If they feel disturbed, they are told it is because they recognize the danger of rebellion within themselves. The institution absorbs dissent by redefining it as personal weakness. The aftermath is quieter but more corrosive. The captive is returned below, their brief visibility erased almost immediately. Records are updated. A notation is made about renewed discipline. Life in the convent resumes with unsettling smoothness. The sisters speak less. Prayers are shorter. Obedience becomes sharper, more reflexive. Fear has been ritualized, made part of daily devotion. This turning point also demonstrates the brilliance of the system's design. Physical escape is nearly impossible, but ideological escape is even harder. Even if someone reaches the surface, they cannot bring truth with them, because truth has no language here that is not already controlled. Any attempt to name abuse is reframed as defiance. Any demand for freedom is recast as corruption. The punishment serves another purpose as well. It tests loyalty. Those who hesitate, who look too long, who falter in their responses are noted. Sister Agnes does not need informants when she has observation. Fear sharpens her awareness. The convent becomes not just a prison, but a sorting mechanism, identifying who can be trusted to uphold the doctrine and who may one day need to be corrected themselves. By the end of this moment, the stakes are irrevocably raised. The novice understands that exposure will not lead to rescue, and escape will not lead to freedom. The institution is prepared to absorb both without consequence. What remains is a choice between silent survival and open resistance, and both paths now lead through suffering sanctified as virtue, enforced not in darkness alone, but under the full light of prayer candles and sacred song. The eighth turning point brings the pressure of the outside world crashing against a system that has survived by sealing itself inward. An outsider arrives not as an obvious threat, but as an administrative necessity. An auditor, a visiting cleric, a benefactor's representative, or a scholar tasked with reviewing records and practices long assumed to be exemplary. The convent cannot refuse the visit without drawing attention, and so it does what it has always done. It welcomes scrutiny with practiced calm. From the moment of arrival, the presence feels destabilizing. The outsider moves differently, asks questions without reverence, and lacks the instinctive submission that governs everyone else within the walls. They notice pauses in answers, glances exchanged too quickly, corridors that feel intentionally avoided. Nothing is provable, but nothing feels settled. For the first time, the convent's certainty is mirrored by uncertainty from someone who has not been shaped by its rules. Sister Agnes responds with precision. She offers hospitality, access to carefully selected records, and sermons tailored to impress. She understands that authority must now perform rather than assume. Her confidence is unwavering, but the effort beneath it becomes visible to those watching closely. Control requires constant maintenance, and the presence of an outsider introduces variables that cannot be fully managed. For the novice, this arrival represents both hope and terror. The possibility of truth escaping the walls feels intoxicating, but it is paired with the knowledge that the system has survived challenges before. She watches how the convent closes ranks subtly, how routines tighten, how certain doors remain locked more diligently than ever. The outsider is never left alone long enough to wander freely. Curiosity is met with politeness and redirection. The tension builds through small moments. A question about missing names is answered too smoothly. A request to see certain areas is deferred on theological grounds. The outsider senses obstruction but lacks context. Without testimony, suspicion remains abstract. The convent's greatest strength is that its victims have been rendered voiceless, erased from both records and memory. As days pass, the pressure begins to fracture the internal order. Some sisters falter under observation. Others become rigid, overperforming obedience. Fear moves upward now, no longer confined to the cellar. Sister Agnes becomes more visible, more involved. Her presence a constant reminder of authority. Her doctrine does not change, but its tone sharpens. She speaks more often of endurance under trial, of faith tested by intrusion, of enemies disguised as servants of truth. The outsider's presence forces a confrontation not of facts, but of narratives. Two versions of reality now occupy the same space. One is orderly, documented, sanctified. The other exists in glances, silences, and the novice's accumulated knowledge. The danger is not exposure alone, but which story will be believed. Institutions survive not by hiding truth forever, but by shaping which truths are permitted to matter. At a critical moment, the novice considers acting. She understands that no perfect evidence will present itself. Records are compromised. Witnesses are controlled. Sounds can be denied. What remains is risk. To speak is to invite immediate retaliation and likely erasure. To remain silent is to accept that the system will continue, reinforced by having survived scrutiny once again. The climax of this turning point lies in the realization that revelation does not arrive as a single explosive moment. It arrives as a narrowing of options. The outsider begins to sense something deeply wrong, but senses alone are insufficient. Sister Agnes prepares contingencies, already framing the visit as persecution should it turn hostile. The convent stands on the edge of either collapse or entrenchment. This moment forces the story toward its final moral conflict. Silence has preserved the system, but speaking may not destroy it. The outsider represents possibility, not salvation. Whether the truth surfaces depends not on righteousness alone, but on sacrifice. Someone must be willing to lose everything for the chance that the walls might finally crack. As the outsider prepares to leave, carrying impressions rather than proof, the novice understands that time has nearly run out. The convent will either be exposed imperfectly, or it will seal itself tighter than ever, emboldened by survival. The final reckoning looms not as justice guaranteed, but as a fragile opportunity balanced on fear, faith, and the dangerous act of choosing to speak when silence has been made sacred. The ending does not arrive with fire or confession, but with a choice made in a moment too small for ceremony. As the outsider prepares to depart, escorted politely through corridors scrubbed of suspicion, the novice steps forward where she was never meant to stand. She does not accuse. She does not explain. She simply breaks a rule that has held the convent together longer than stone. She speaks plainly, without doctrine, without metaphor, without reverence. She names the cellar. She names the sounds. She names the records. And most importantly, she names the people who were made to disappear. The words land unevenly. Some are dismissed. Some are misunderstood. But they cannot be unheard. The outsider does not respond with outrage, only with stillness, the kind that signals attention rather than judgment. Sister Agnes moves to intervene, her voice calm, prepared, already shaping the narrative of delusion and temptation. But the rhythm has shifted. The novice's refusal to sanctify her fear fractures the authority that depended on language being controlled. What follows is not immediate justice. Investigations take time. Institutions resist. Doors remain locked longer than they should. But the system has been marked. Questions begin to outpace answers. Records that once protected now contradict. Silence, once seamless, develops seams. The cellar does not empty overnight, but it is no longer invisible. Sister Agnes does not flee. She remains, certain to the end that she has done nothing wrong. When she is finally removed, it is not in chains, but in disbelief, unable to comprehend a world that no longer accepts her definitions. Her doctrine collapses not because it is disproven, but because it is no longer obeyed. The novice leaves the convent quietly, without blessing or farewell. She carries no proof, only the weight of having spoken when silence promised safety. The bells continue to ring each morning, but they sound different now, stripped of certainty, echoing over walls that have begun, slowly, to listen back.